we first decided on a beach vacation, it sounded like the perfect escape from our stressful lives. I had just wrapped up my sophomore year of college, and my friends Emma, Mike, and Jess were equally exhausted. The plan was simple: a week at a secluded beach house, away from all the chaos. The beach house was a charming old place with whitewashed walls and a wraparound porch. It was nestled at the edge of a small town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows as it dipped toward the horizon. As we unpacked the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I chalked it up to paranoia. The first couple of days were blissful. We spent our mornings lounging on the sand, afternoons exploring the town, and evenings around the fire pit, telling stories and laughing. But by the third day, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost imperceptible events. Items we were sure we had left in one place would turn up somewhere else. Footprints that didn't match any of ours appeared in the sand around the house. Jess, ever the skeptic, laughed it off, but I noticed a tension in her eyes. One evening, while walking back from the beach, we spotted a group of people standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the dunes. They were too far to make out any details, but their presence was unnerving. When we called out, they turned and disappeared into the trees. By the fourth day, the atmosphere had shifted. The carefree laughter was replaced with nervous glances and whispered conversations. Mike insisted on checking the locks twice before we went to bed, and Emma started keeping a kitchen knife under her pillow. That night, I woke up to a noise outside my window. Peering through the curtains, I saw shadows moving around the porch. Heart pounding, I crept out of bed and woke the others. We huddled in the living room, listening to the sounds of footsteps and hushed voices outside. In the morning, we found more footprints around the house and a crude symbol carved into one of the porch pillars. It looked like an eye, staring right at us. We decided to leave the next morning. As we packed, the tension was palpable. We all felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread. As we loaded the car, we noticed them again. The same group of strangers, now closer, standing at the edge of the driveway. Their eyes were cold and unblinking. "Get in the car!" Mike shouted. We scrambled inside, and he floored the gas pedal. But the road was narrow and winding, and as we sped away, they gave chase. The car jolted as something hit the back window, shattering it. Jess screamed, and Emma huddled in the back seat, clutching the knife. "Just keep driving," I yelled, as Mike swerved to avoid the strangers now blocking the road. One of them leaped onto the hood, a wild look in his eyes. Mike slammed on the brakes, sending him flying. We sped off again, hearts racing, as the town disappeared in the rearview mirror. We finally reached the nearest town and found safety in a crowded diner. We called the police, but when they arrived, there was no trace of the strangers. No footprints, no broken windows. Nothing to prove our story. The rest of the vacation was spent in a cheap motel, far from the beach. We tried to piece together what had happened, but there were no answers. The police wrote it off as a prank or a misunderstanding. But I knew better. I still see their faces in my nightmares, those cold, unblinking eyes. And sometimes when I'm alone, I feel that same unsettling gaze, watching, waiting. The beach house, we later found out, had a dark history. People had gone missing from that area before, their disappearances never solved. We were the lucky ones, they said. We got away. But did we? It was a summer trip, a much-needed break from the grind of our daily lives. 3 of us, me, Jake, and Lily, decided to spend a week in a remote cabin in the woods. It sounded perfect. No cell service, no work emails, just nature, good friends, and relaxation. The drive up was long, winding through thick forests and up steep hills. As we drove deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around us, blocking out the sunlight and casting long, eerie shadows. It was late afternoon by the time we arrived at the cabin. It was an old rustic place, but charming in its way. The logs were weathered, and the roof sagged a little, but it had a cozy feel to it. We unloaded the car and settled in, each of us claiming a room. The first evening was perfect. We cooked dinner over the fire, drank beer, and told stories under the starry sky. As night fell, the sounds of the forest surrounded us, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional hoot of an owl. It felt peaceful. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange unease. The silence was too deep, too oppressive. I tossed and turned, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, I drifted off to sleep, but my dreams were filled with dark, twisted shapes and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. The next morning, I shrugged it off as nerves. We spent the day hiking and exploring the area. The woods were beautiful, dense with ancient trees and carpeted with thick moss. We found a stream with crystal clear water and spent hours just lounging by it, talking and laughing. As the sun began to set, we headed back to the cabin. That night, the feeling of unease returned, stronger this time. I kept hearing noises outside, branches snapping, leaves crunching. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The third day, things started to get really weird. We were hiking again when Jake found something strange. It was a circle of stones, perfectly arranged, with strange symbols carved into them. It looked old, ancient even. None of us could read the symbols, but they gave us all the creeps. "Let's just go back to the cabin," Lily said, her voice shaking a little. We all agreed, and the hike back was silent. That night, the noises were louder, closer. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of footsteps outside my window. I wanted to get up and check, but fear kept me frozen in place. Around midnight, I heard a blood-curdling scream. I jumped out of bed and ran to the living room, where the others were already gathered, looking terrified. "What was that?" Lily asked, her face pale. "I don't know," Jake said, "but it came from outside." We stood there listening, but the scream didn't come again. Finally, we decided to go back to bed, but none of us slept much that night. The next day, we were all on edge. We decided to stick close to the cabin and not venture too far into the woods. But even in the daylight, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent us spinning around, expecting to see someone or something there. That evening, as we sat around the fire, the atmosphere was tense. We talked about leaving, but it was a long drive back, and it would be dark soon. We decided to stick it out one more night and leave first thing in the morning. But that night, everything went to hell. I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. Footsteps echoed through the cabin, slow and deliberate. I heard Jake's voice, low and scared. "Who's there?" There was no answer, just more footsteps. I got out of bed and crept to the door, peeking out. Jake was standing in the living room holding a baseball bat. Lily was behind him looking terrified. Suddenly the door slammed shut and the footsteps stopped. We all jumped, and Jake tightened his grip on the bat. "Whoever you are, get out!" he shouted. Silence. Then, from the darkness, a voice. Low, gravelly, and full of malice. "You shouldn't have come here." We all froze. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "This place is not for you," it continued. "Leave now, and maybe you'll live." "Show yourself," Jake demanded, but there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness. We heard the sound of windows shattering, and a cold wind swept through the room. In the dim light of the fire, I saw shadowy figures moving outside, circling the cabin. Panic set in. We grabbed whatever we could for weapons and huddled together. The voices started again, whispering from the darkness, taunting us. "You can't hide. You can't escape." It felt like hours passed as we waited in the dark, hearts pounding. The shadows grew bolder, pressing against the windows, trying to get in. Finally, Jake couldn't take it anymore. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. "But how?" Lily whispered. "They're everywhere." "We'll make a run for the car," Jake said. "Stick together and don't look back." We nodded, too scared to argue. With a deep breath, Jake threw open the door, and we sprinted outside. The shadows surged toward us, but we fought our way through, reaching the car and piling in. Jake fumbled with the keys, and the engine roared to life. We sped down the dirt road, the shadows chasing us, but they couldn't keep up. As we drove away, the cabin disappeared into the darkness, and the voices faded. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we found a small motel and collapsed into the beds, too exhausted to talk. Something was in those woods, something dark and evil. We never spoke of it again, but the memories haunted us. I still have nightmares about that night, and sometimes I can still hear the whispers. It all started as an adventure, an exciting journey to the Swiss Alps with my best friend Max. We had planned this trip for months, eager to escape the monotony of our everyday lives and immerse ourselves in the stunning beauty of the mountains. Little did we know, this vacation would become the most harrowing experience of our lives. We arrived in Zurich on a sunny morning, our spirits high and our backpacks loaded with gear. From there, we took a scenic train ride through the countryside, the landscapes gradually transforming from rolling hills to towering peaks. Our destination was a small, secluded village called Grimselwald, nestled deep in the heart of the Alps. It was a place straight out of a fairy tale, with charming wooden chalets and snow-capped mountains as far as the eye could see. The village was quaint and peaceful, with friendly locals who greeted us warmly. We checked into a cozy inn run by an elderly couple, Herr and Frau Müller, who treated us like family. Our room had a breathtaking view of the mountains, and the air was crisp and fresh. Max and I couldn't wait to hit the trails and explore the wilderness. The first few days were perfect. We hiked through lush forests, crossed crystal-clear streams, and marveled at the stunning vistas. At night, we would sit by the fireplace in the inn's common room, chatting with the Müllers and other guests, sharing stories and laughter. It was everything we had hoped for and more. But then, things started to change. On the fourth day, we decided to venture deeper into the mountains, away from the well-trodden paths. We had heard about an abandoned cabin high up in the hills, a relic from the early 1900s that had been left to decay. It sounded intriguing, and we were both eager for a bit of adventure. We packed our bags with supplies and set off early in the morning, following a narrow, winding trail that led us higher and higher into the mountains. As we climbed, the weather began to change. The sky grew dark, and a cold wind swept down from the peaks. By the time we reached the cabin, thick clouds had rolled in, casting an eerie gloom over the landscape. The cabin itself was a dilapidated structure, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades. We explored the cabin, finding old, rusted tools and broken furniture inside. It was fascinating, but there was something unsettling about the place. The air felt heavy, and a strange silence hung over the area. We decided to leave before the weather got worse, but as we stepped outside, we noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the trees. They were fresh, too fresh to be old, and they didn't belong to us. Max and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we didn't say anything. We simply started our descent, moving quickly and keeping an eye on our surroundings. The hike back was tense. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow began to fall, thick and fast. The trail was difficult to follow, and we stumbled several times, our nerves frayed. It felt as if we were being watched, though we saw no one. By the time we reached the village, we were exhausted and on edge. That night, as we sat by the fire, We told the Muellers about the cabin and the footprints. Herr Mueller frowned, a worried look in his eyes. He told us that the cabin had a dark history, that it was once the home of a reclusive hermit who was rumored to practice dark rituals. According to legend, he had disappeared one winter, leaving behind only his footprints in the snow. Frau Mueller tried to reassure us, saying it was just an old village tale, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We went to bed that night with a sense of unease, the wind howling outside like a banshee. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was a soft tapping, like someone knocking on the window. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent. I crept out of bed and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. There, standing in the snow, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its face hidden by a hood. The figure stood perfectly still, just staring at the window. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, waking Max. "What's wrong?" he whispered, groggy with sleep. "There's someone outside," I said, my voice shaking. Max got up and looked out the window, but the figure was gone. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, unable to sleep, listening for any signs of movement outside. But the only sounds were the wind and the creaking of the old inn. The next morning, we told the Muellers what we had seen. Herr Mueller looked grim and told us to stay close to the village. He said that sometimes, during the winter, people went missing in the mountains, their bodies never found. It was best to stay where it was safe. But Max was determined to find out more. He convinced me to go back to the cabin to see if we could find any clues about the figure. I reluctantly agreed, though I had a bad feeling about it. We set off again, following the same trail as before. The weather was clear this time, but the atmosphere was still heavy with tension. When we reached the cabin, we found it just as we had left it. But the footprints were back, leading away into the trees. Max followed them, his curiosity getting behind my heart and my throat. The footprints led us deeper into the woods to a small clearing where we found an old abandoned mine shaft. The entrance was boarded up, but the boards were loose, as if someone had recently breaked them open. Max pushed the boards aside and peered into the darkness. "We should go back," I said, my voice trembling. "This is a bad idea." But Max ignored me. He climbed into the shaft, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. I had no choice but to follow him, my fear growing with each step. The mine was cold and damp, the walls lined with moss and dripping water. We moved slowly, our footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. After a while, we came to a large chamber, and what we saw there made my blood run cold. The chamber was filled with strange symbols, carved into the walls and floor. In the center of the room was a stone altar, stained with dark, dried blood. Around the altar were the remains of animals, their bones picked clean. It was a scene of horror, and I wanted nothing more than to turn and run. But then we heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the passage we had just come through. We turned off our flashlights and pressed ourselves against the wall, holding our breath. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then the figure appeared in the doorway. It was the same hooded figure I had seen outside the inn, but now, up close, I could see its face. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. The figure moved to the altar, muttering in a language I didn't understand. Max and I exchanged terrified glances. We knew we had to get out of there, but the figure was blocking our only exit. Slowly, we began to inch our way around the edge of the chamber, trying to stay out of sight. But then Max stumbled, his foot catching on a loose stone. He fell to the ground with a loud thud, and the figure turned, its glowing eyes locking onto us. It let out a horrible, inhuman scream and lunged toward us. We ran, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we sprinted down the passage. The figure chased us, its footsteps echoing in the dark. We burst out of the mine shaft and into the daylight, but the figure was right behind us. We ran through the woods, not daring to look back. The village was in sight, but the figure was gaining on us. Just as we reached the edge of the trees, I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I screamed and turned, but there was nothing there. Max and I stumbled into the village, gasping for breath. The Millers rushed to our aid, their faces filled with concern. We told them what had happened, and Herr Müller immediately called the local authorities. A search party was sent to the mine, but they found nothing. The symbols, the altar, the bones, all gone. The authorities dismissed our story as a case of hysteria, brought on by the isolation and the strange atmosphere of the mountains. But Max and I knew the truth. We had seen something in those woods, something dark and ancient. We left Grimselwald the next day. Our dream vacation turned into a nightmare. As we boarded the train back to Zurich, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched.